This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the best all-in-one platform for all of your website building needs. Hey guys, it's Celestia, and if there's one thing a room full of artists will always argue about, it's the importance of fundamentals in art. Some will argue that they should always be studied and mastered before moving on to stylization, the learn the rules before you break them crowd, while others believe that they're not necessary at all if you just want to make art for fun with no desire to improve, or want to make really stylized work that disregards them intentionally. Others still, and I fall into this group, believe that they're best learned at the same time as you make the art that you want the way you want to, even if it's stylized in a way that disregards them, so that you don't burn out just on studies of things that you don't enjoy with no fulfillment from drawing the way that makes you happy. Learn the rules while you break them, as I've always said. A lot of these mixed responses are driven by the fact that not all art fundamentals are equally applicable, if at all, to all styles and types of art. So, for example, spending months learning the ins and outs of realism-based fundamentals if all you ever want to draw is anime or chibis or cartoons may not be a good or reasonable use of your time. I felt that way, which is why I spent a long time just drawing anime without any real understanding of the fundamentals back in high school, only to learn later that actually there are some fundamental art rules that do help you to know and understand no matter what your style is, and it was holding me back not to learn them. But they can also be really daunting, especially to beginners who don't know where to start. I mean, it's hard to know which ones are going to be applicable to your work if you don't learn them all first. And while I do think that that's worthwhile, it's also a very large task that isn't necessarily appealing to artists just starting out. So in today's video, I'm going to give some quick, beginner-friendly summaries of the most important points of the most relevant fundamental art rules that I think any artist of any skill level with any style could benefit from knowing. The ones you maybe actually should know before you start breaking them. But first, let me take a moment to thank the sponsor of today's video, Squarespace. I've been incredibly lucky to spend the past several years working with them on the channel, but I've been using their platform for much longer than that. And throughout the creation of everything from joke sites to test and show off their features, to my actual professional portfolios that I use in my career, I've gained more than enough experience with them to confidently say that, at least in my opinion, they're the best website building and hosting platform there is. They're always my first recommendation for artists looking to build polished, professional-looking portfolios, because I know firsthand how perfect they are for it. My previous cutesy branded portfolio is very different from my current, revamped, more professional one, but both were just as easy to build there using all of the tools that they offer. Pre-built layouts for a wide variety of commonly used site pages, the ability to duplicate pages and individual elements, the option to add tons of different types of content from text and photos to audio, galleries, calendars, forms, and so much more. But it's honestly just as easy to build any type of site that you need there, because they have perfect options for anything in their gigantic library of designer-made templates, easily sorted and browsed by category. And no matter what type of site you build, you can easily turn it into an online store, because they give you everything you could possibly need to do so. The ability to manage payments and inventory, handle shipping and fulfillment, and boost your SEO so that you're getting as many people and potential customers seeing your site as possible. It's perfect for selling physical goods like merch and paintings, but it's just as great for selling services, like consultations, editing, and best of all, art commissions, because they make sure you have everything you need to do so. A streamlined workflow, built-in appointment scheduling, email marketing tools, and so much more. Your customers have just as easy of a time shopping as you do selling, too, because they offer all of the most popular payment methods like Klarna, ACH Direct Debit, Apple Pay, Afterpay, and ClearPay, and even allow you the option to send individualized branded invoices to specific clients, so you can start accepting orders from all around the world with just a few clicks. So whether you're an artist in need of a portfolio, an entrepreneur building an online store, a creator setting up an interactive blog, or a small business owner making a landing page, Squarespace is the place to do it. And you can find out yourself by going to squarespace.com to get your own free trial today. And once you've built the perfect site that you're ready to launch, you can get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain by going to squarespace.com/touchescelestia, linked in the description. Big thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring today's video, and please go check them out. Now, let's get into the fundamentals, or at least the very specific parts of some of them that I think any artist can find value in understanding and implementing. Anyway, I can't stress enough that if you're serious about growing as an artist, it's still very valuable to study the fundamentals in their entirety, far beyond the brief summaries and breakdowns I give in this video. But since that's very specifically not the point of this video, I'll move on. Number 1, composition. Basically, how the different elements in your art piece are arranged to form the entire work. The main goal when it comes to composition is to place the primary subject or subjects that you want people to look at in a place that their eye is naturally drawn to, which isn't quite as simple as it sounds. A lot of beginner artists think that's a problem very easily solved by just placing the subject directly in the center, which is one of the biggest mistakes you can make if you want to make a dynamic piece of art. Because yes, viewers will know exactly where they're supposed to look and look there, but placing them there also tells the viewer, okay, just look at this, nothing else matters, eliminating the possibility for any other background elements to create a compelling scene that still highlights them as the subject while also grabbing much more attention. I'm not saying it's always a bad thing to place your subject dead center, and there are certainly instances in which it's appropriate and effective, but if your goal with the piece is for it to be attention-grabbing, compelling, and immersive, that is definitely not the way, because more often than not, it comes across as flat flat and kind of boring. The viewer immediately and straightforwardly perceives only the subject as the only important part of the piece and writes off the rest, leaving little attention to be given to anything in the background, and little feeling of dynamic movement to give that subject character. It also just doesn't take long for them to look at and understand it, so they don't spend long actually appreciating it. Similarly, if you just put the subject off to one side with the background elements on the other, you're also going to run into problems. An equal 50-50 divide like that often leaves the brain torn between which side to look at, rather than perceiving them both as parts of the same piece, unsure where their focus is actually supposed to be. That's where the 70-30 rule comes into play, which is one that applies to a lot of different fundamental rules, and one that we'll therefore be coming back to often throughout the video. For now though, I'm going to focus on how it applies specifically to element placement and composition. As a general rule, the most compelling compositions are those in which the primary subject takes up 70% of the visual space, and the background, environment, or secondary elements take up the remaining 30%. I'll show some examples of what I mean on screen. It ensures that the primary subject is contrasted by its supporting elements, but neither drowned out by them nor drowning them out. This can't always be achieved solely by applying the rule to the composition alone, and not the color or values, but we'll get to that later. It's still very important in composition regardless, and arguably more important than either of the other two categories I just mentioned. But the subject can take up 70% of the visual space while being placed dead center, meaning that rule on its own isn't quite enough all the time. So let's get to the role of the rule of thirds. It's one of many guidelines used by artists to ensure that they place their subjects where the viewer's eye is most naturally drawn to, and therefore create the most compelling possible compositions. You divide the canvas into thirds and place the piece's focal point or points in the areas in which those lines intersect. This forces the viewer's eye to be naturally carried through the piece and drawn to the subject rather than perceiving only the subject immediately, creating immersion and balance, and utilizes the negative space surrounding it to highlight and showcase it, which is why it's also important not to fill that negative space with too many other elements, placing them primarily in the focal point or points that you've decided on. If you're trying to create movement in your piece, using two opposite focal points is helpful to place your background and foreground, and if you're deciding on a horizon line, placing it on either horizontal line is usually very effective. The reason the rule of thirds works is because it essentially capitalizes on the way the human brain naturally views an image by placing key elements in the places it's drawn to. And if you want to understand why, I'd recommend that you look into the golden ratio, which some people say the rule of thirds is just a simplification of. I don't know if that's actually true, and there's always been some debate, but looking into the golden ratio is always a good idea anyway, as well as the plethora of other helpful compositional guidelines out there. The rule of thirds is just the simplest, hence why I'm focusing on it in this particular video. But I've spent way too long on composition alone for a video that's supposed to be quick and simple, so let's move on to number 2, values. Essentially how light and dark each element of your piece is, which you want to vary in order to add depth and further reinforce where the viewer's eye is supposed to be drawn to by making those areas stand out through contrast. Color often makes us think that different elements in our pieces stand out from one another because their colors are different, which blinds us to the possibility that their values are so similar that they actually blend into each other instead. You may think that your character stands out from their environment or background because their background is a very different color than they are. But if the background colors and the character's colors are similar in lightness or darkness, they may still blend into each other because their values don't contrast. My advice is always to either make the piece in black and white to begin with, so that you're forced to separate elements and define composition based on values alone, and then add a clipped color layer to color over it afterwards. Or just shift your piece to black and white every once in a while during your process, to ensure that its values are sufficiently contrasting or complementary. For traditional artists, you can take photos of your work and then shift the photos to black and white to achieve the same result. The 70-30 rule applies to values too, as I warned you before that I would come back to, largely because it's not just a composition rule. It really just means that 70% of the piece should be defined by one primary characteristic, and the remaining 30% should be defined by a secondary one, which applies to more than just subject placement. In terms of how it applies to values, most people advise that your piece should have 70% dark values and 30% light values depending on where you want the eye drawn, or vice versa. Others advise the use of 70% midtones and 30% light and dark if you want a more balanced and less dramatic vibe. If your values are mostly just midtones, there's no contrast. The same is true if it's mostly just light tones or dark tones. Aligning your use of values with your composition, using 70% light for the 70% of space your subject takes up, and 30% dark for the 30% of space your background takes up, helps emphasize the contrast that composition built. Reverse it, and you'll have a totally different but equally effective vibe, which is another thing to consider. In my experience, it's most effective to make a value scale for each piece that you make, particularly for pieces that are intended to be dramatic, immersive, or environmental. I've also found it beneficial to limit it to only 3, 4, 5, or maybe 6 values, so that they're all meaningfully different from one another. The smaller the number, the more dramatic and the more challenging. For the average piece, I usually recommend 4 or 5, which is also the reason that that's usually the number of colors present on those color palettes you see on Pinterest. And speaking of colors, that brings us to number 3, color theory. How colors interact with each other, complement each other, and convey tone, setting, and emotion. This is going to be a wildly oversimplified explanation, but the point is to oversimplify and boil it down just to the the points I believe to all art, so bear with me, and please study the topic further if you want to fully understand color theory and its applications. Let's look at the color wheel. Complementary colors are opposite each other, and when used together are excellent at creating contrast in a piece, like an orange background behind a blue subject. Analogous colors are next to each other on the color wheel and create a softer, more harmonious vibe when used together. How you combine those depends on the piece that you want to create, and one example is the triadic color scheme, which basically makes a triangle in the middle of the wheel and utilizes the colors that align with each point. It maintains the contrast of the complementary and the harmony of the analogous, and is both popular and effective as a result. There are a million ways to utilize different combinations, and that's barely scratching the surface. But complementary, monochromatic, tetradic, you should look into them if you're interested. But the bottom line is that their application in your work is generally most effective when it, too, follows the 70-30 rule. Some artists prefer really high contrast colors, while others prefer softer looks. But regardless of the color scheme you use, 70% should generally encompass one end of the spectrum and 30% should encompass the other, like 70% warm tones and 30% cold tones, and vice versa. Speaking of, which percentage is warm and which is cold massively impacts the feeling of the piece, because colors are associated with feelings. Warm colors are associated with, obviously, warmth, safety, happiness, and comfort, while cool colors are associated with cold, harshness, sadness, and melancholy, at least in North American culture. Having 70% of your piece where the subject is done in warm tones, while the remaining 30 is cool, will make it feel like the subject is in a warm, comforting place, like they've come in from the cold. The opposite would make the warm 30% in the background feel like the enticing light at the end of the tunnel that they want to reach, from the 70% cool in the foreground. It depends on the piece, but considering the connection colors have to emotions is always important when deciding on your palette and how you use it. It's not just that particular example though, because like warm tones equal comfort and cold tones equal the opposite is based on the spectrum of tones used, but the most vibrant of those tones individually have different associations. Red, despite being a warm tone, is associated with anger and danger, while blue is associated with sadness, neutrality, or even safety. That doesn't just have applications in your art pieces individually, but also things like character design, when you're trying to use color to communicate a character's moral alignment and identity. But moving on, let's talk about number 4, perspective, the angle and lens through which a piece is being interpreted and viewed, or more technically, how an artist creates the illusion of 3D depth in a 2D piece of art. It's very complicated in study and practice, and again, I would strongly encourage independent study far beyond this video into all of it, particularly because I'm specifically focusing on what I believe is universally applicable and generally simple. And generally simply, the most important rule of perspective is that elements in the background of a piece get smaller the farther away they are from the foreground, in accordance with the horizon line and vanishing point, per the example on screen, and the angle from which they're viewed skews based on where they lie. Applying orthogonal lines, these diagonal lines that span outwards from the vanishing point, gives you a good point of reference as to where to place elements, their size, and the angle from which they should be depicted, something that many digital art programs can automatically do for you. In most cases, you can even adjust the vanishing point's proximity to the foreground, determining how dramatic of a distance you want there to be between the foreground and background. In general, though, to gain a foundational understanding of the basics of perspective, I was always taught that it was helpful to look at photographs and determine where the horizon line and vanishing point are, and try to envision orthogonal lines over it based on where the surrounding elements are. I always found that helpful, and even that basic understanding alone can be applied to any art style to make sure that your pieces feel believable and establish depth and consistency, so that it feels like all elements within them are part of the same world being viewed by the same eye. But let's move on to number 5, shapes. Breaking subjects down into their core shapes and building on them. The reason that how to draw an owl meme exists is because most of the basic art tutorials out there focus mostly on the shapes and then add a comedically ridiculous amount of detail to them way too quickly without any explanation, which is obviously a flaw. But starting with those shapes isn't wrong, and it's very important to be able to break your subject's form down into them so that you can easily gauge how large or small each one is in relation to one another, and efficiently use them to build that subject's general shape in a piece to be defined later. Starting with details is never effective, because drawing the perfect arm with gorgeous fabric folds on the shirt sleeves is irrelevant if the arm is completely the wrong size compared to every other part of the body. Build the bones, then flesh them out. Shapes are how you do that. If the shapes you start with are wrong, the end result will be wrong, no matter how many details you add. Something I learned from experience as someone who made the detail first mistake many times in my earlier years. Speaking of young Celestia's many mistakes, let's get to number 6, anatomy. It's very related, and it's the understanding of how the human, or animal I suppose, form is built. Basically how different parts of the body interact with each other. This is a fundamental that definitely isn't on its own applicable to every style or form of art, because a lot of them exaggerate anatomy. But the important part that does apply to even the most exaggerated art styles is proportion. You want to make a really long arm that can't exist in reality? Cool. But to maintain believability, make sure the forearm and upper arm are still the right sizes compared to one another, and utilize the same joint and muscle interaction present in realism, like where they bend. The same applies to legs, and really all anatomy, unless you're deliberately trying to make them look inherently wrong or off or uncanny. If not, it's all about maintaining proportion ratios. Even if the only thing you know about anatomy is how far certain limbs and features are from one another, you can apply that to any style and make it better, in my opinion. As I mentioned, this is an example of a mistake I made, because I failed to do this with faces. I started drawing in the anime style before learning where different facial features were supposed to be placed in relation to each other, something I'm still trying to unlearn. But my brain still filters the faces that I draw through the anime lens before adjusting them to realism instead of the other way around, and therefore doesn't apply the proper rules. It's incredibly annoying and something I'm trying very hard to fix. But examining how far facial features are from one another and then exaggerating from there is always the best call, even if it isn't the one I made. Check out the Loomis method if you want to build a better foundation for that than I did. But next is number 7, light and shadow. How they both interact with your subject and the entire scene that they're in. If you're just starting out and don't want to be overwhelmed, I'd recommend just picking one light source for your pieces rather than multiple. One area from which light is shining and the opposite in which shadow subsequently falls. Based on that, be sure not to just blanket the light part with light tones and the dark part with dark tones, because that's not how light works. In most cases, the area that's closest to the light source will be subjected to both the brightest light and the harshest shadow where that light doesn't hit, although the contrast depends on proximity to the source. The areas of the piece furthest from the light source are generally more diluted in terms of contrast, and blend into each other much more, with the exception of reflected light or multiple light sources. While 3D models have their share of flaws, they're great at letting you emulate how light will interact with a subject to get a good idea of how this works. And I always recommend the app Handy, which is free with micro purchases available for bonus models, and lets you adjust light sources and rotate models very easily. Finally, light and shadow don't interact with all surfaces and textures equally. Light won't hit a carpet the same way it'll hit a hardwood floor, even when it's the same light source, nor will it affect hair, skin, and clothing the same way. Considering that and looking for specifically relevant references is always beneficial, as is looking into the difference between soft and hard lighting, and the other million forms of lighting that exist that I won't get into because I need to move on to number 8, consistency. It's not really a fundamental on its own, but a combination of them. Only you get to decide how much you want to apply all of these rules to your art, if at all. But to develop your individual style and adapt those rules thoughtfully and effectively, you should follow, bend, or break them consistently, at least within each piece. If you choose to disregard or use a rule in one area, make sure you do so in other areas the same way, too. Otherwise, the piece might end up feeling way too chaotic and disorganized to be perceived the way you want it to be. Make it believably unbelievable if you want to exaggerate, because yes, you make your own rules for it based on your knowledge of these ones, but you still have to follow the ones that you make. The people viewing your art, for the most part, aren't necessarily comparing it to reality if it's obvious that it's not supposed to be realistic. They're comparing it to other aspects of your art. If your character is obviously supposed to have gigantic hands based on your stylization, they get that. But if the other hand is normal sized, they're gonna look at it and think it seems off or wrong. Use the fundamentals to make your own rules that don't necessarily follow them, but make sure you apply those rules to the entire piece with consistency. But I think that's the perfect place to end this. Break the rules if you see fit, and make your own in the process based on your understanding of them. These are the rules that I think every artist should know about the fundamentals, but not because I think they should always follow them, because I think they should always bend and break them based on their knowledge of them, not because they lack it. I know I opened by saying that I believe you should learn the rules while you break them, and not learn the rules exclusively before you break them, and that is true, but these are very simplified versions of those rules that I think can help artists break them while learning the wider concepts they encompass. So I feel like I get a pass for kind of half-ass contradicting myself. Thank you for watching, and special thank you as always to channel members Joseph Solomon, TC Pratt, Haruki Saluzzo, Extinction Animation, Lorik Darkbolt 9481, Kazuna Indy, Grey Jazz, Drawing Amongst Stars, Another Foxboy, Pale Star Poppy, and Cybertory VT, as well as patrons Batman, Kyle Lowe, Kim Nguyen, Crazy Asar, Gentong, MG, Blah Mage, TC Pratt, Celine Moongazer, Eldritchia, The Stray Dog, Decagon, Jenny Chan, Catbus, Lucia Majiki, Selena Bibi, Pryday, Peel, Wing Tang Wong, Marie Greer, Potato, Jazz, Voidwalker, Latte Tabby, Christian Cook, Adam Sorovietz, Doriaki, Varius, Hailstorm, Emo Queen Jules, Show, That's It, Craig, Scarlet Flame 234, The Names Are Gone, Luuka Owo, Art of Amethyst Fable, Maho Stars, Kuro Yusha, and No Name, and I'll see you in the next one.